Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I'm here for my LEC week number 3 overview and analysis video here in the summer split. We've gone over every single week, of course, of the LEC leading up to this. You can check out all of those videos up in the iCard right now. Up there as well is, of course, going to be the primer that I did in the preseason, or I guess pre-summer split in the midseason, if you will. But today we're going to be going over week 3. We're in the back half. Typically speaking, week 3 has been the final week of the regular season in the LEC, or at least kind of the best of one stage. That is no longer the case. Now there are 4 weeks. These weeks are shorter. I think it was a good decision overall to allow the LEC to actually have like a smaller break in between this and Worlds. Last year it was so crazy how long teams had to wait between winning the LEC and, playing the season finals and then going to Worlds. It was a pretty long break for them, and I think that really hurt their performance at the tournament. Hopefully this is a change that will help rectify that, but no longer the final week. I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. We're going to learn a lot more about these teams in this video, so I'm excited to go over it. If you are new here, what we do on this channel is go game by game, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we talk about, and at the end of the video I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to kind of tie everything into a nice neat little bow. We will of course also be updating my personal power rankings from number 1 to number 10. Always a good disclaimer at the beginning of LEC videos. In particular, the power rankings are very much subject to change. These are very variable power rankings. This is just my personal opinion, and especially in the LEC, especially after weeks like this, it's basically impossible to get a real read on a team. Best of ones is not great for trying to identify what teams are good and what teams are bad, but we're gonna try our best. And so without further ado, let's jump right into the content. I don't want to waste too much of you guys' time at the start of the video, and that means starting with day number 1. And of course, day number 1 kicked off with our typical BDS game. It's BDS taking on Rogue this time, and BDS is going to pick up the unsurprising victory here. Rogue kind of showing a lot of the Rogue things that they do. This time, instead of being incredibly anti-proactive and just sitting and waiting for the game to progress into the late game, they actually did try to make plays, but a lot of those plays were horrible, and unfortunately that means that they did really struggle to try and beat a team in BDS that I have called the barometer over the course of this split. They are kind of the separator between whether or not a team is good and whether or not a team is bad. If you can beat BDS, you're probably a pretty good team. If you can't beat BDS, you're probably not that good of a team. They are kind of the gatekeepers, if you will, for the upper echelon of the LEC. Their schedule has actually been pretty light. They've really not faced a ton of the top teams so far, and so, we'll see how things continue to go for BDS, but for now, this is a good win. They're at 5-1. That's a great place to be. Player of the game for me is going to go to Adam in the top lane. I think a lot of people are going to want to see the bot lane get this. Ice and Labrov both played great, but I think that was more Comp and Zoelise playing really bad than it was Ice and Labrov really dominating. Ice got a lot of, things kind of force-fed to him in the late game out in the Zeri, and he was able to take over some of those fights. It's the role he's filled all split long, really all year long for BDS, this reliable carry that doesn't really have to do too much in the early game, but Adam was taking things into his own hands. Of course, you get that solo kill in the top lane on Finn, but just the aggression that he showed. I know a lot of people don't really like Adam, and I understand that he can be a bit more of a feast or famine player, but at this point you can say he's a bit of a channel darling. I think that is a pretty fair thing to say, all things considered. I have constantly put him as, at worst, like a top 2 or a top 3 top laner in the LEC. At the beginning of the year, I put him at number 1. So I really do believe in him as a player. I think his upside is just higher than any other top laner when he is winning and when he does play well, and this was a good example of that. Finn was just not able to survive. You pick Ornn to try to survive on the top side of the map, to be weak side, to not really do anything. Finn decided to try and contest a bit more, and Adam really made him pay for it. He did a good job transitioning into the mid to late game as well, but the laning phase is really what he's getting this player of the game for. But of course, Ice and Labrov did a very good job. Comp and Zoelise were miserable in this game, and Ice in particular took advantage of a lot of the mistakes that Rogue was making down on the bottom side of the map. He's just been very consistent for this team. I don't think he's a star. I don't think he's an A-graded player at this level, but he certainly is very good, probably around that B+ kind of level. He's going to do really well with the resources that you give him. He's not always going to be the most proactive AD carry in the world, but as a team fighter, you're really not going to find other players that are more consistent than Ice in that role in the back half of these games. Labrov is also somebody that I really do like. I still think he's a top-end support at this level, and he once again showed the big gap between him and the other supports with Zoelise here. Sheo and Nuke were also fine. I think Sheo was definitely better. Nuke is really starting to concern me. He's not had a particularly good split, even with BDS winning. He's just kind of been lacking in terms of his ability to lane 1v1. I think generally he was fine. Talia is just one of those champions that's going to be useful essentially no matter what. You're going to scale in any context. Even if you're not dealing damage, you do so much else for the rest of your team that Talia just makes everything so much easier. But this was Adam and this was the bot lane, in my opinion, that were really carrying BDS, and that's very reminiscent, in my opinion, of last year for BDS. And then then for Rogue, this team just sucks. Like, usually we talk about how inactive and how lacking agency they are in terms of their games, but that really wasn't the case in this one against BDS. They were just straight up bad. They just straight up played bad, and there really wasn't a lot for them to do to kind of rectify that. Zoelise is a really easy choice for dead of the game. Not really sure what he was doing here, constantly engaging without the rest of his team there. I mean, specifically the time where his carries were backing under tower and he just decides to full send it on Leona and just die instantly. Like, I don't really know what's going on. Zoelise really looked promising at the start of winter, and then ever since then, it has just gotten worse and worse and worse. I know this team is bad, but Zoelise is a big reason why they're bad. I'd love to give him some grace because he's a rookie on a bad team, but he has been horrible for them. He's truly been one of the worst supports in the LEC, like a true detriment to this team. Nobody else was particularly good either. I almost gave this to Finn for, again, just being way too overeager in the top lane. He doesn't have the mechanical skill to beat Adam on Ornn. Like, that's a crazy matchup to try and take on the top side. Like, maybe not matchup-wise. That's fine matchup-wise, but it's a crazy fight to try to take early on in the game, especially when you have Karthus and Ezreal and Tristana and a lot of these things that should be applying pressure elsewhere. Karthus doesn't want to try to help you on the top side. Ezreal isn't really going to be somebody that's pushing their lane. Tristana wants a lot of those resources early, and so Ornn really shouldn't be doing what he was doing in this game. Finn just played it really bad. He had a really bad understanding of the matchup, and he got really punished for it. Larson, Comp, Marcoon, generally whatever. Like, Marcoon wasn't very good. Got completely out-jungled by Sheo, but a lot of that was his lanes just getting absolutely destroyed. Comp kind of got inted by his support, so there's really not a lot I can say about that, and Larson was generally inactive, and he was the kind of rogue holdover as per usual. He just didn't really do anything, didn't really take any fights. Rogue is not good. Like, there's really nothing else for me to say. When it comes to this team, they are not good. They're not good when they try. They're not good when they're not trying. Like, it's just not a very good team, likely the worst in the LEC, and BDS is good. Like, this is still a team that very easily could make Worlds, and I know a lot of LEC fans don't like to hear that because they, for some reason, think that BDS is this low upside team. I can kind of see where they're coming from. I do think BDS is low upside in certain areas, like Ice is probably a bit of a lower upside AD carry. Sheo and Nuke as a mid jungle are probably lower upside, at least at an international level. That's kind of what I'm saying here, but Adam, Labrav, I think these players could be real difference makers, and I do think if this team does finish as a top 3 team, you know, goes to Worlds from the LEC, I certainly think there could be worse representatives in terms of what you would want to see on an international level. And then moving on to game number 2 here of day number 1, and it's a decently interesting matchup between Team Heretics and SK Gaming, and SK is going to pick up again an unsurprising victory. They've looked significantly better over the course of the beginning of this split than Heretics, who has looked like a complete disaster, and trust me, that continued here. Heretics just does not feel like they have any sort of read on the meta currently. They don't feel like they have any sort of read on what works for their individual team, and that's really hurting the individual performances of the players. I still think there is a lot of upside on this team if they were to figure it out, if they were to try to find a style that works for everybody, but right now they're taking a lot of agency away from their own individual players, and I think it's really hurting them overall, and SK is kind of the opposite. They are getting the most out of their players. This team has gone from being a perennial lower tier team, like a team that's going to compete for 6th place every single split, to a team that very, very realistically could make Worlds right now from the LEC. I think that honestly is the expectation for SK, at least with how they've performed so far, and they lived up to that in this series. They gapped them everywhere. There's really not one singular lane that ended up being less impactful than the other. Everybody was incredible in this one for SK, but player of the game was a pretty easy one. It's going to go to Niski. Some phenomenal team fighting coming in from him on the Azir, and I will continue to defend Niski forever. I still to this day even get a lot of comments on this channel where it's like, Niski just doesn't have the same consistency. You know, he'll win games, but he'll also lose games for his team, as if every other major mid laner in the region doesn't do that, as if Humanoid, who everybody ranks above him by a major amount, doesn't do that more regularly than someone like Niski does. It's a little bit weird for me. Niski has consistently been a part of winning teams. He has made teams better by being on them, and honestly, he is more consistent than the rest of them. He'll have bad games every once in a while, but it's not nearly to the level of players like Nuke or players like Humanoid, like I said, you know, Zviru on the other side of this. A lot of other players that get hyped up a lot around the league. I think Niski is just as consistent as them. Now, maybe his highs aren't as good as theirs are, but I do think his highs are still there, and we're seeing what he can do when he's given other lanes that are really successful. He's just as good at making everybody else on the team look amazing as he is making himself look amazing. That ult at Rift Herald at 15 or so minutes into the game truly ridiculous. Like, it is a game-winning Azir ult on the spot. He really is just a dominant team fighter when he's allowed to do the things he's comfortable on, and that's what he was able to do here. Niski is an awesome player. I think Isma was also incredibly good this game on the Sejuani. I've been questioning Isma. If there was a reason that I was a little bit worried about SK and their ability to be like a top-tier team, it's that I'm just not sure Isma can be a top-tier jungler right now. I think he could theoretically get there. Again, I was really impressed with him in the winter split because of his aggressiveness. It felt like his level 3 timers were the strongest of anybody in the league. He was kind of like mini Malrang, if you will, and how he tried to play the game. That was very much taken away in terms of how SK wanted to play once especially Rahel and Luan came in, but it really wasn't even there in spring, and I was concerned that that lack of aggression, him just kind of quote-unquote playing in structure, was not necessarily his strength as a player. But here we are on the Sejuani. He was a perfect frontliner. His engages were great. His macro was great. He was everywhere he needed to be. This was a really good game from mid-jungle, and honestly, they were the carries. Like, yes, bot lane is still the most impressive part of this team, and a lot of attention has been going their way, rightfully so. Rahel and Luan have been a major addition to this team, and they've made them better, but mid-jungle have been awesome as well. Mid lane in particular has been a positive. Irrelevant continues to be very good on the top side as well. I still don't know if he's going to be this like superstar game breaker. Like, he's definitely taken more of a backseat role now that bot lane is strong again. I think that that fits Irrelevant super well. He is like your perfect weak side top laner in the sense that he will win 1v1 super regularly so long as you give him a good matchup. Rahel and Luan don't really need counterpick. Niski and Isma don't really need counterpick. Irrelevant is often saved for that R5, and I think that really helps him. If he gets good matchups in the top lane, he's really strong. The problem has always been that when he gets counterpicked, he's not very good at playing losing matchups, but, you know, you can live with that. If that's your big deficiency as a top laner, that there are way worse traits to have. But all of that combines to SK being one of the scarier teams in the league, and Heretics, unfortunately, is just not on that caliber. This team has failed to live up to expectations at every single possible turn, and honestly, at this point, I'm very close to just kind of giving up on them as a potential top 5 team, or anywhere in that vicinity. They stayed at number 6. I think they actually even went up to number 6 after last week because everybody in the LEC was so bad, and at least Heretics won a game, which is something that other teams have just not been able to do. But losing so completely like this, like losing everywhere, is really disappointing. And again, this team just has a really poor understanding of what they do well. I mean, Jankos on Karthus, okay, whatever, right? Like, try to get him to farm up. That's not what Jankos does. He's not the kind of player that's going to be able to take over in this kind of environment. You've got someone like Flakked on the Kai'Sa. His best trait is how good he's been in the 2v2. That's why you brought Trimby in the first place. So great, you're putting him on a champion that basically does not exist in the 2v2. And then you put Zviru on Tristana. He is a mage player through and through. Like, I get it. Like, Trist is really strong right now, and if you have to pick it, then pick it. But Zviru's not good on it, and that's very, very clear. He's going to get dud of the game here. Niski outclassed him in every single aspect. Not only was he ahead in the laning phase, which is a disaster for the Tristana. That is about as worst case scenario as it could possibly get. But Zviru was also late to every single one of these fights. It just didn't feel like he was comfortable on the champ. It didn't feel like he was connected with the rest of the team. Like, I don't really know what else to say. Zviru has honestly lost a lot of my trust over the course of this split. He showed some interesting things in spring when he was inserted as the starter, but now here in summer, this has been bad. He's been one of the weaker mid laners by far in the LEC, and that's really not a good sign. Like I said, Flakked and Trimby just need better opportunities. Trimby on Nautilus is just not it. Like, I want to see him on Enchanters. I want to see this team try to play for the 2v2. That's why they brought him in. That's what he does at a high level, and they continue to misuse that. Flakked on Kai'Sa, what are we doing? Like, he didn't make mistakes, but he also is this team's best player by a large margin right now, and they put him on a champion that has no agency in the early game to just allow SK to dictate the tempo entirely. Wunder has been really bad on the top side of the map. Ironically enough, he has been irrelevant on the top side of the map in terms of what he has offered Heretics. He has really disappointed me over the course of this split. This team just seems to be falling apart. They are not competitive. They don't have good chemistry. I don't really know what to say. This is not a good team right now, and SK is a very good team. Again, they're going to be competing for a world spot. That is very clear. I don't know if they're guaranteed to get it, but at 5-1, they're looking incredibly strong, and honestly, it might just take a top 1 or 2 team to even like remotely try to compete with them right now in terms of talent. And then moving on to game number 3 here of day number 1, and it's a very, very interesting game to talk about. It's Team Vitality taking on GIANTX, and GX is going to pick up their second win of the split. They're sitting at 2-4 going into the second day here, and that's actually really not that bad of a position to be in. Quite frankly, GX is in the same spot that they have been in over the last 2 splits. This is kind of what they've been all year. They've been a team that doesn't really have a ton of talent, a team that really isn't expected to finish anywhere outside of the bottom 2. They've been projected in the bottom 2, I think, for me, every single split. I could be wrong about that. Somebody might fact check me on that, but at the very best, they've been 8th in terms of my preseason predictions, and then they take advantage of these teams that are just collapsing around them, these teams that have major errors to pick up wins, enough wins to get into the playoffs and finish 8th. Like, that's who GX has been every single split, and that seems to be what they're going for here. I think they have more upside. I think some of these players are starting to lock themselves in a bit more now. I certainly think that giving the keys to Jackies in the mid lane has been a good thing for this team overall, but it's just them taking advantage of a team in Vitality that is just in complete freefall mode. Their 2-0 week last week appears to not have stuck, as a lot of the issues they had in week number 1 just returned here. It didn't really feel like they got better. It didn't really feel like they evolved as a team or learned from those, successful games last week. It feels like they just kind of went back immediately to what they were in week number 1, except now they're having individual misplays. It's not just these weird communication errors that, allow the rest of the team to just be in areas that they shouldn't be. Like, it's not Hylissang being pushed forward when the rest of the team isn't there to support him. It's not, Photon being disconnected. It's not Linsas being a little too slow on roams. It's not any of these communication things. It's just individual misplays, and that is even more of a disaster for Vitality. So we'll talk about it, but for GX, player of the game is going to go to Jackies in the mid lane. Really funny, he picks VTO's quote-unquote, off-meta pick against him. VTO was kind of known for that Kai'Sa mid last year on Heretics. He was really good in the summer split with that. He picked it so much that it kind of became a bit of a signature for him. Of course, he's well known for the LeBlanc as well. I'm not trying to sit here and say it's his most valuable pick, but as an AD carry mid, it's one of the ones that can work the most because it really is an AP carry out of the mid lane. Jackie's built full AP in this game and looked really good on the Kai'Sa. He was like 5k gold up on VTO by the end of this game, something ridiculous. He was just dominating this matchup. He won it super hard in the laning phase. I think Kai'Sa actually has some potential as a mid laner, more so than Ezreal. Ezreal's getting a lot of hype because Quid played it over in the LCS. And of course, it's also been gaining a lot of traction in Korean solo queue, but I think Kai'Sa has a lot more potential to be consistent in the mid lane, and Jackie's went ahead and showed that here. He continues to be GX's best player, I would say by a large margin, but that would be disrespectful to the Antonio on the top side. Antonio has actually been phenomenal for this team. I think Broadcast gave him player of the game here, and I honestly completely understand. The Malphite shut down what Vitality was doing. Their full AD essentially outside of the Taliyah coming out of the jungle, and the Taliyah was a bit of a problem, but Malphite can pretty easily deal with Taliyah, and the rest of this team can also pretty easily deal with Taliyah, but shutting down the Ezreal, shutting down the Senna, shutting down the Twisted Fate, especially after early laning phase, Malphite was just a really strong pick here, and quite frankly, Antonio has been really good for this team. I know that there was some questions about whether or not he deserved his call-up here to the LEC, whether or not he was going to be the player that just kind of fit into a role and was never really all that bad for this team. Hopefully you could get some stability or whatever, and, that synergy with Juhan was hopefully going to be a good thing, but as it would turn out, he's actually really good. He's this team's second best player, and it's by a pretty clear margin. Patrick and Ignar were fine. This game were certainly the better bot lane. We'll talk about Karzi and Hilly, who were both not good, although I think some of their problems are going to get extrapolated out into something bigger. Juhan was definitely a lot more consistent. When the rest of his lanes are winning, he's going to look good. He's not somebody that's going to salvage games, but he can be generally fine in structure. GX was just good here, and Vitality was just really, really bad. Again, a lot of really weird plays coming in individually from these players. Dead of the game is unfortunately going to go to Hylissang. I know it feels like I'm constantly defending Hylissang when he's going 0-8-1 in games like this, and it just feels like, what are you doing? Like, how can you defend him? He's looking so bad, but it really is easy to see that they picked Twisted Fate, Ezreal, Senna as their 3 carries, and Hylissang just had to die for their sins. Like, every single fight, he is the only tank on this team. He's constantly having to go in or peel or be the one to die first in fights to just give Vitality any sort of chance to win anything. His job this game is to absorb as much damage and CC as he possibly can and then die. Like, that is his job, and unfortunately, the rest of the team wasn't doing enough, but in that role, unfortunately, he was a bit of a scapegoat, and unfortunately, at least in this circumstance, that's going to be enough for dud of the game. Even if I don't think it was entirely his fault, I do think there was a lot of blame to put on the carries here, specifically VTO and Karzi, who I think both played really bad in this game. I was always expecting to receive pushback for my thoughts on Karzi because he is so popular. I do think a lot of that is due to his Twitter presence rather than his gameplay, but his aggressive gameplay does inspire a lot of fans, and it inspires a lot of confidence in people. I'm just not as high on the consistency of Karzi because every once in a while he will just have games like this where he is genuinely horrible, where his positioning is bad, where he's not playing aggressive enough, where he's really not trying to do anything, where he just kind of lets his team lose, where he lets Hylissang look like he's the worst support in the league. This was a horrible game from Karzi, and this is why I will always keep him out of the top 2. I'm not going to say always, because if he improves this, then I will, obviously change my tune, but this is who Karzi is. He's player of the week last week in the entire LEC, and then he comes out here in week number 3 and plays this Senna game and gets completely outplayed by Patrick and Ignar. It's a disaster, right? This is what holds him back from being like a B+ kind of player in my eyes. But VTO was also completely outplayed. He has honestly not been very good this split. I don't really know what to say about VTO at this point. We all know the talent's there, but he has also shown kind of very similar trends to someone like Carzzy, where he's just never going to be consistent enough to be somebody that ends up being a positive for the team overall. And that's the worst thing. Like, if Jackie's is outplaying you, that's fine. Jackie's has clearly taken that next step coming into the summer split. He's become a, like, real good LEC mid laner. Like, he's not someone who's just kind of in the league in the same vein as, you know, someone like Zviru or, you know, someone that we've talked about previously. He has become one of the scarier mids, and so for VTO to lose to him, it's not the worst thing in the world. It's just frustrating to see this happen week over week over week, and for VTO to go to something like the Ezreal mid, something that is a bit different in terms of, like, how it wants to play, and not be able to execute on it. It feels like he's jumping on a trend and not necessarily knowing why that trend is popular in the first place. And there's criticism to go away all around. Like, Photon wasn't very good after laning phase. He dominated lane, and then the Twisted Fate fell off entirely because he's going into Malphite. Linsas was generally the most valuable, but that's only because he was playing Taliyah into this matchup where Taliyah is incredibly strong, and even then he still wasn't really able to control any of the map, and he was late to every single fight. His macro has been relatively poor. Vitality just doesn't seem to have any sort of consistency at all. They don't really seem to have any sort of thing to hang their hat on. It's on a game-to-game basis. They're just relying on their players to be talented enough to win bad situations, even with bad communication, and that's not good enough in the LEC. For GX, they're able to take advantage of a team like that. They are talented enough to be able to win games, and they do have good cohesion, and so you're sitting at this point where even if they are one of the least talented teams in the league across the board, they're going to go up against these teams that are really struggling to find any sort of, like, thing to hang their hat on, and if they can do that, they're going to be the number 8 team again. It's going to be the same story as what we've seen the last few splits. So for GX, I'm excited, but I don't see this team having crazy upside. I think they're just doing a good job with the role that they've been given. And then moving on to game number 4 now here on day number 1, and it's always a fun matchup between these two teams. It's G2 Esports taking on Corp, and G2, just like every other time, is going to pick up the victory here. This is not an upset by any means. G2 has been on a roll. They were 1-2, obviously, in week number 1. They have not lost since then. Of course, it's only been 3 games, but those 3 games have been difficult opponents, and they've looked relatively good in those games, and so I feel pretty good about G2. I've not moved them from my number 1 spot all split long, because why would you? It's G2. We all expected them to get back on track. It's not really a surprise at all that they were able to get back on track, but Corp on the other side has real issues. This team is honestly just not performing all that well right now after a 2-1 start where they were kind of gifted that second win in week number 1 by Mad Lions. They have not really been able to follow that up with anything. They're 0-3 in their last 3, kind of the opposite, the inverse, if you will, of G2 after that start, and now they're landing in a spot where it's even questionable whether or not this is a talented team enough to get into the top 8. Like, are they talented enough? I don't know. Like, it really is up for debate. They have some good points, and there have been some good moments from Corp, but they're certainly not locked in by any means. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game for me is going to go to Yike in the jungle. I think one of the clear differences between these two teams was the proactivity and the ability to control the map coming out of the jungle position. Yike was just exceptional in this game. I'm a big Yike defender. I think that he is an incredibly good player. For the most part, has been, at worst, the 3rd best player on this team over the course of this year. For most of the year, he's been the 2nd best player on this team behind Caps. Broken Blade obviously steps it up when it matters. He's been great in the playoffs and in MSI, but in the regular season, I would say that Yike has pretty consistently been this team's 2nd best player. The way he controls the map, the way he's able to consistently have pressure and prio in a lot of these lanes. You're just not seeing that in a lot of other junglers, especially not consistently. And we saw in this matchup, like, jungle gap was huge. Like, the canyon was real in this one for Yike, and his ability to do that really is what put G2 ahead, but it was kind of a bit of everybody. I think the bot lane had a really good game here. Hansama on the Kai'Sa, Mickey X still going to that Poppy. That was the comfort pick that he found out about at MSI. He has continued to go towards that. Mickey has always been a player that's leaned a lot more towards comfort than he has towards meta. I think that that's generally fine. Again, G2's more talented than everybody that they're going up against, and so not playing meta isn't something that could punish them super hard. And, you know, it's all up to teams and whether or not they're used to playing against Poppy and whether they're prepping for Poppy throughout the week. I think Mickey does a great job of being able to shut down a lot of these more passive team comps, and we kind of saw that here with Corp, where they didn't really have a lot of tools, I would say, to work with early on in the game here because of their draft. So credit to Hans and Mickey. Hans was really good, by the way, on the Kaisa. I didn't really talk about it, but he capitalized on a lot of the creation that G2 did. I think a lot of it was set up by the Xin, by the Sedge, by the Poppy. Hans was more the one just kind of capitalizing on that, but he was, the one capitalizing, and I think that does count for something. He just needs to be a good AD carry. Again, we're not expecting him to be this world-class ADC. I don't think that that's on the docket for them, but if he can be someone that can consistently win team fights when set up properly, that's going to be fine for G2. And then Broken Blade on the top side, I really like Sedge flexed into the top lane. I think it's actually a really strong pick right now. Top lane tanks are a little bit undervalued, I think, because a lot of aggressive top laners exist in the West right now, and so we're not really seeing things like Sedge get picked nearly as regularly. But in terms of setup, if you want to go for a more aggressive jungle, but you don't want to sacrifice the power that something like Sejuani gives you in late game team fights, then just pick both. Pick the Xin Zhao and the Sejuani and put Sedge up on the top side. It's just as good of a strategy. Caps was ironically the least valuable player on G2, and he's kind of been a little bit this split. Like, he's still been good. I'm not going to try to say he's been bad by any means, but he's certainly not been the game breaker that he was through the first two splits of the year. That being said, again, G2 has nothing to play for. Like, they're literally playing for nothing this split, and so I can understand why they might be playing a little differently than they did in winter and spring. For K-Corp on the other side, this team is just collapsing. They are falling apart. They have a couple of players that are really underperforming. Obviously, none more than Targamas in the support position, who's just been brutal this year. There's really not much left for me to say when it comes to Targamas. He is probably the worst player in the LEC. He's going to get done of the game once again here. It just feels like he is entirely disconnected from the rest of this team and from the rest of this roster. I really don't know what to do. Like, I really don't know how to communicate that. It seems like he's not talking. Like, every time they pan over to him on cam, like, he's not talking, he's not communicating, which was always supposed to be a bit of a strength for him as a player. And then you watch some of the plays he's making, and it just doesn't feel like he's on the same page as anybody else he's playing with. It feels very disconnected, and he feels very much in his own head. I don't feel like keeping him on this team is going to help him, and I certainly don't think it's going to help this team. It feels like something just has to change. I get that Targamas is very loyal to K-Corp. I get that Kalista wants, Targamas here. Like, that's kind of the argument, is that, their young prodigy AD carry wants to play with Targamas next year, but right now, it just doesn't feel like that's going to be good enough for K-Corp. It feels like that is dragging them down in terms of their consistency, but it's not just him. I see a lot of people just pointing the finger at Targa and saying that he's the only player playing poorly. I think the top side of the map has been really disappointing, not only Kana, but especially Closer. He has been exactly what he was last year for 100 Thieves, which is really a bad thing. Like, that is a huge negative. Remember, we were expecting him to bounce back after the worst split of his career, or the worst year of his career, really, in 2023, where he was bad. Like, truly one of the worst players in the LCS. He was a negative towards his team overall. A lot of people attributed that to the fact that he was playing with double lift, and he's really not somebody that likes to play a resourceless style in the early game, but that's exactly what he's been doing here on K-Corp. He's been playing really slow. He's not going for a lot of these early aggressive plays that made him such a good jungler for 100 Thieves and Golden Guardians in the past. It's just been negative for Closer overall. He has been one of the weakest junglers in the league, and Kana has also been losing on the top side. I don't think it's been nearly as bad as some people would like to make it out to be, but, this is why we always talk about, I don't know how imports are going to come in, because sometimes a new environment can just drain a player of skill, and especially if he's not on the same page as the rest of his teammates, he can look kind of bad, and Kana's looking really bad right now. I think Vladi has upside. I think upset is generally fine, but Vladi might be the best player on the team right now, which is really not an ideal thing to say. K-Corp does not look good, and G2 luckily does look good for them, at least. This is not a team that I am ever worried about. Like, even if they were 0-5 at this point, if they were 0-6 going into the second day here, I still wouldn't be worried about them because it's G2. Again, they have nothing to play for this split. This is all house money for them. This is all basically just an extended scrim. And so for them to still be winning super consistently and to still be putting out good performances, I mean, it just reinforces the fact that they're the best team in Europe. And then moving on to our final game here of day number 1, and it's a top versus bottom of the table clash as Mad Lions Koi took on Fnatic. And Fnatic is going to pick up the win here. This is not a shocking upset. Fnatic stays undefeated. They move to 6-0 to start the summer split. Just about as perfect of a start as you could possibly get. This is the MSI buff that we always talk about with Western teams. It's really funny how a lot of Eastern teams get this like MSI hangover where, or at least it's kind of talked about that you get this MSI hangover where you go to this big tournament, you go pretty deep, deep into the tournament and you're a little bit burnt out, so when you come back to the domestic league, it's a little bit of a worse performance. It's kind of the opposite for Western teams, at least historically. Teams that go to MSI typically come back just so much better than every other team that they are playing against because, you know, they don't make it as far, ironically enough, but they still get all of that scrim practice and training against some of the best teams in the world, and they just kind of improve in a lot of areas while they are at that tournament, and so when they come back, they are just kind of leaps and bounds better than a lot of the other teams that they're playing against. We see it with Fnatic here, we're seeing it with Team Liquid in the LCS, we saw it last year in the LCS with Golden Guardians, the year before in the LCS with Evil Geniuses. It's been a pretty consistent trend in the West, and Fnatic is upholding that. The 6-0 start, they're really clean gameplay. It's just been kind of a joy to watch. Player of the game is once again going to go to Razork. He is, you know, right in the running for MVP of the split. It's certainly going to be, you know, a fun competition between him and like maybe Rahel over on SK, who's been playing really well. There are a lot of people right now in the LEC that I think are playing at a super high level, but Razork might be near the top of that list. He has been exceptional all year long. I will continue to die on the hill that this is by far the best year of Razork's career. I don't think he's ever played as consistently as he's been able to over the course of 2024, because, you know, the highs for Razork have always been there. The good games have never really been a question mark for him. It's always really just been about like, oh, the bad games are there too. Oh, every once in a while he'll lose the early game super hard and just completely collapse. He'll fold in and the game will be over by 20 minutes because Razork just has no pressure. That was his problem on Misfits. That was his problem on Fnatic the last couple of years, is that the bad games were really noticeable. They were really, really influential. And that's just not happened this year. The bad games really haven't existed as much. I still don't know if he has gotten better at playing jungle from a negative state, because he's in a positive state every single game. Like, this team is winning early every single game. His aggressiveness, his ability to control the tempo of the game, and his mid-game pressure, it's just better than everybody else that he's going up against right now. He is playing like the best jungler in the LEC, and it's not particularly close in terms of performances. But the rest of this team was also good. I want to give a big shout out to Oscar Rinnan, who's actually had a really good split so far. I'm lower on Oscar Rinnan. I've been, you know, historically a bit lower on Oscar Rinnan, but this has been an awesome split. He hasn't gotten nearly as many of the headlines because Razork and Noah have been really good this split, but Oscar has been excellent, exceptional in the top lane. He has really been able to control a lot of his own laning phases, and he's been able to win no matter what the matchup is. This time he got a good one, but it's not always been a good one for him. Noah, Jun, they were fine. Noah inted down the stretch of this game on the Zeri, but Jun was excellent on the Leona, clearly the best Leona in day number 1 here of week number 3. And then Humanoid was also fine. He's actually taken a bit of a step back in terms of his carry potential, and I think that that's a good thing for the team overall, because we know Humanoid can carry if he needs to. We know in big situations he's going to show up, but to see him kind of be more of a, you know, setup player, like a Niski type of player for Razork, I think is actually a really big thing for Fnatic, showing that they can go to that style and still be very successful if they need to be. So I feel very good about Fnatic. If G2 wasn't in the league, they would be a clear number 1. And then for Mad Lions on the other side, they're just awful in a lot of different ways, and I see a lot of anger and frustration pointed in a couple of different directions. I think some of it is valid and some of it is not. I think the social media conversation surrounding Mad Lions is something that I personally pretty heavily disagree with. We're just seeing constant conversations about how this is why you don't, you know, let Elyoya, you know, build the team or whatever. This is why you don't trust your guys. And it's like, I feel like that's such a bad takeaway from this. I feel like it's such a negative takeaway that just because this team is really starting to struggle right now, that they're running into quite a few issues, means that you had like bad process in the first place, when these are the same people that literally 4 months ago were talking about how Mad Lions was the smartest org in the LEC because they turned over their entire roster, they got rid of this super flippy team, and were able to get these young guns that they, you know, were able to build around. It just feels like such hypocrisy from a lot of the community, and, you know, I hate to call that out because it feels like such a strong word, but really at the end of the day, it's such results-based thinking. As anybody knows, I'm a data analyst in my day job, and results-based thinking is something that you are taught to stay away from in basically every aspect. I think Mad Lions' process was fine. I think it's just not working out in the summer split right now, and I especially think the players that they're throwing blame at are, it's crazy. Like I see a lot of blame thrown at Supa, and I get it, right? He is the loudest. He's the one who talks the most in terms of this team. He went out and said he's the best AD carry in the West. You know, whatever, right? He's not the best AD carry in the West, but it is absolutely not debatable that he is by far the best player on this team. Like, I don't know how you could watch a single Mad Lions game this split and not see anything other than Supa trying his absolute best to win games and everybody else running it around him. This was one of his worst games of the split. He was still by far the best player on Mad Lions, and what we've seen is that when he wins, Mad can win games, but if he doesn't win, like, it is doomed. Like, there is no one else on this team that can win. It is literally Supa 1v9ing every single game. Alvaro has helped with that, but he had a really bad game here. It's very weird to me that Supa is the one receiving a lot of the criticism here when he is so clearly the best player on this team. It reminds me a lot of, for my LCK viewers, Jiwoo over in the LCK on Nongshim. Like, that's how I feel about Mad Lions. It feels almost exactly like Nongshim, where Supa is kind of this player who's trying his best and is really interesting, and the rest of this roster is just collapsing around him. A dud of the game is going to go to Elyoya. He has been miserable this split. Like, I can't explain it. This guy has been a perennial top 1 or top 2 jungle in the league ever since he entered it in 2021, and now we're sitting here and it's like, can this guy even play at the LEC level? Like, what are we doing? This Sejuani game was miserable. Razork completely out-jungled him. The tempo wasn't even remotely in their favor, and he single-handedly lost every single lane just because of the way he was jungling. Merwin got destroyed on the top side. He has been awful this split. Maybe the worst top laner in the LEC. Frescow, he was in a side lane the entire game on Corki. He finally teleports into that final fight and just instantly dies. It's like, what are we doing here? He has also been awful this split, and Alvaro had probably his worst game of the split as well. Mad Lions just feels completely disconnected, but I feel like some of the negative attention on them is being thrown in the wrong direction, at least from my perspective. And then for Fnatic, again, if it weren't for G2, this would be the best team in the LEC by a large margin. The difference between Fnatic and anybody in third place, whether it's SK, whether it's BDS, whoever you want to put in that spot, is ginormous. You know, G2 and Fnatic are the top 2 teams in the LEC, and that just becomes more and more clear as we continue to watch. But now that we are done with the first day of the week, it's time to move into day number 2, and we kick day 2 off with certainly a game between Rogue and Team Heretics, and Rogue is going to pick up the win, and all that was confirmed to me in this game is that Rogue can only win when the other team just completely loses the game on their own. Rogue doesn't win games. The other team that they are playing loses games, and that is what happened here. In the first week of the season, you know, I identified that potentially Rogue could actually be better this split because this meta does kind of fit them, where games are going a lot longer. Game length has shortened a lot in the LEC over the last few weeks, and obviously that has hurt Rogue, but they're still going to be able to pick up wins when they're hand gifted to them in every single form or fashion. Heretics is a dumpster fire. This is one of the worst teams in the LEC, and there's just nothing else left to say. This team is garbage. Like, they might not even make top 8. They are really in danger of that right now. Honestly, the race for bottom 2 is real. Like, a lot of teams are competing for that. There are 4 or 5 teams that could feasibly all be bottom 2 right now, like, realistically, and that is really not a good thing to say. Top 4, and then everybody else, like, it's top 2, 3 and 4, and then everyone else that's fighting it out for lower end standings, and I don't really know what to say about it at this point. Every team in the LEC just feels kind of bad at the bottom of the standings, but for Rogue, they at least did some things right. Finn played a pretty good game. He's going to get player of the game for me. You know, I had to decide between him and Zoelise. I thought they were by far the 2 best players on Rogue in this game, and that's a good sign. You know, they were the 2 players that I thought played the worst on day number 1, so to see them come out in day 2 and actually look pretty good, I think that that's a positive overall, but Finn was the one I gave the nod to because of his just advantage in the top lane. That's really the best way I can put it. He was up like 2 or 3 levels throughout the entirety of this game, and you got to give him credit for that. He is a player that's never really going to give up. I think that that is something that's admirable. Poor Finn has just been on bad team after bad team for a little while, ever since he left Rogue the first time. He went to CLG. That team was an utter disaster. Came back to the LEC, got a job on Excel, and that team really underperformed. Then he went to Astralis, and that team was never really all that great. And now he's here on Rogue, and this team kind of sucks. Like, it's got to be a pretty miserable existence to be playing for last place teams every single split. And, you know, I'm sure it takes a mental toll on a player, but Finn, you know, credit to him, he never gives up. Like, he is a player that's going to play until the end. He's going to try in every single game. He's never really going to get tilted in that kind of way, and that shows in games like this where Heretics had a gigantic lead. They were pushing to end the game, and all of a sudden they throw it. Finn was the one to really create that and to really kind of make that a point, so credit to him. I thought Zoelise was also really good this game on the Nautilus. I very much considered giving player of the game to him. One of the better performances he's had in the LEC, full stop. This actually very much felt like how he played against G2 in that first matchup in the Winter Split. I remember that game very vividly, where Zoelise was unbelievably good as an engager. You know, there was something there. It was an interesting series, and it was something to talk about, but he has obviously gone on a pretty negative path since then. This is kind of a flash to show that it is still potentially there, but the consistency absolutely has to improve. It's great that he can do this in a game, but he's got to be able to do it more than he has the bad games. Comp was good. I think a lot of people are going to be really impressed with the Ezreal. I was slightly less impressed. I thought he was just generally fine, capitalizing on what the rest of the team was doing. Marcoon was good on the Ivern, except for the fact that he was super down in farm, but it's Ivern. Like, you live with that. And Larson was his AFK self, farming up until eventually Team Heretics ran it down in a fight, and all of a sudden the Azir was super relevant. You know, it's Larson. It's how he plays the game. So you know, Rogue did their thing. I think this was more Team Heretics losing than Rogue winning, and that's really on Team Heretics. This team is bad. Like, there is nothing else left to say. They have problems everywhere on the map. Wunder's going to get my dud of the game here on the Ornn. Like I said, he was down like 2 or 3 levels for a majority of this game, so much so that if you're playing Ornn and you're down in levels, well, now you can't actually upgrade a lot of the items on your side. The big benefit of Ornn is those item upgrades, and if you're not getting those, then all of a sudden that champion becomes significantly less useful. Wunder has just straight up been bad. Like, we've been talking about the worst top laners. I think Merwin has been the worst top laner in the LEC this split, but Wunder has been like right there with him as somebody that is just not able to win, not even really able to survive on that side of the map. It's been a bit of a disaster for him. GIANTX got a ridiculous lead. He played Karthus and got super strong because of all the farming he was able to do, especially into something like Ivern that can't really punish him for that farming. It just became a bit of a, okay, well, GIANTX is going to destroy in the late game, and then he did absolutely nothing with it. They were trying to play for him as the carry, and it did not work. Zviru was jumping in and dying in fights where he had no business dying. Trimby was going in and disconnected from the rest of the team. Flakib, you know, to his credit, was trying to do damage, but again, on things like Varus, he can't really hyper carry games. Heretics just feels like a disaster. They are losing everywhere on the map. It is just not working out. There is nothing good that I can say about this team. In a right and in a just world, this team would be bottom 2, but there are so many bad teams at the bottom of the LEC that this team might still have the ability to get in. If they win one more game, they're probably in. This final week is going to be pretty massive for them, but sitting at 2-5, certainly not ideal, because Rogue is also sitting at 2-5. Again, this team should be bottom 2. We'll see how the final week of the season ends up panning out for them. There is a chance that they make playoffs for the first time this split, but you know, they probably shouldn't. They're all they are is a team that can capitalize when other teams hand them the game. And while that's good, like, they're not even as good at that as a team like GX, you know, in the LEC. So I don't feel particularly better about Rogue because of this win. I just feel worse about Heretics, and that's a really negative saying overall, I would say. And then moving on now to game number 2 of day number 2, and it's another decently good one here. GIANTX taking on Team BDS, and BDS is going to pick up their 6th victory of the split. They are very quietly moving to 6-1. That means at the very least they will be in 2nd place by the end of this week, depending on what happens in the big Fnatic G2 game later on in the day. But BDS looking incredibly good. Like, honestly, very underratedly great. Their macro is maybe the best in the league. Fnatic's looks a little bit better right now. G2's theoretically should look better at their best, but BDS is right up there with both of them in terms of their decision making, in terms of their ability to play out neutral situations, and I think generally speaking, it's really hard not to look at BDS and see anything other than like a really good team. Like, they are really, really solid. Again, maybe not the flashiest of teams in the world, but they do such a good job at beating teams that they are better than. And I think that that's definitely going to be something that they can hold their hat on, especially with most of the LEC really struggling right now. And for GIANTX, this team's fine. Like, again, they are exactly who we thought they were. They are a team that is going to be able to beat teams that are in complete freefall mode. You know, we saw it this week with Vitality, but they're not going to be able to go up and actually compete with teams like BDS that actually know what they're doing. GIANTX just doesn't have the talent. They don't have the upper ceiling to be able to do that. They are kind of the BDS of the lower part of the standings, if you will, where their inherent skill level is enough to push them above, you know, some of the other teams that are just complete disasters, but they don't really have the upper echelon in order to, like, really make any noise, which is why they've been perennially, like, the 8th best team in the LEC. But we'll go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game is once again going to go to Adam in the top lane. How many good Adam games in a row do we need before we talk about Adam as the best top laner in the LEC? Like, I get it. You know, Broken Blade's really good, and I love Broken Blade. You know, Photon's really struggling right now for Vitality. That certainly opens up something. I know people will throw someone like Irrelevant into that conversation. I think Adam is the best top laner in the LEC. I know I didn't have him ranked as such because that's because he was a bit slower in the spring split. He certainly wasn't perfect in spring, but he's been back to his regular form in summer. Like, I'm not going to say he, you know, the spring downturn in terms of his performance, that was out of character for him. That's not who he has been on BDS. And so this version of him where he is playing like the best top laner in the league, that is the version of Adam to expect, I would say. And he's just able to win so many matchups. Again, I really think that a lot of his problems in terms of champion pool are completely overstated. The guy has clearly proven that he can play whatever the top lane needs. Obviously, the gods picks, the aggressive picks, they really work, but Renekton, Cassante, like these super meta, super staple picks, he still plays them at a super high level. It's not like he can't play these more meta champions. He can just do both, and I think that that's very valuable for BDS. I've always been Team Adam in terms of his performances, obviously his on the Rift stuff, and it seems like whatever happened at the end of winter that kind of took this team a little bit of time to get back. In spring, it feels like it's back now because Adam is playing great. I also want to give a big shout out to this bot lane. I honestly think they're going under the radar for just how good they've been. Ice and Labrov have once again been one of the best bot lanes in the LEC. They were dominant in winter. They looked incredibly good, incredibly stable. Labrov, in particular, looked like the best support in the LEC in the winter split. Things weren't quite as good in spring. I think a lot of people really lost trust in this bot lane because of that, but again, they are much closer to what they were in winter right now than what they were in spring, and again, that's a really good sign. Labrov really showing out in a position that is very weak at the LEC level in support. We knew it was going to be weak going into the year, but Labrov has been excellent, and Ice has been great too. Dude was up like 3k gold, like a full item, with a 1-kill Jinx. Like, it's just it's the small differences like that. I say small, like, that's not a small difference, but it's these micro decisions that Ice is making. It's his ability to lane super consistently that gets him these gigantic leads and allows him to teamfight more consistently than anybody else in the league in the late game on champions like Jinx. Nuke was still fine. I'm still a bit concerned about him. He really has not been great out of the mid lane position, and Sheo was good here, but again, Sheo is somebody that's been a bit inconsistent for BDS over the course of this year, but I'm so in on top and bot when it comes to BDS that I still think this is going to be one of the teams to beat if they can get over whatever jitters they have in the best of fives. And then for GIANTX on the other side, I'm not shocked by this loss. I'm not shocked by this performance. Some people are going to see the solo lanes as underperforming in a series like this or in a game like this. I think this is just more of what you would expect going up against a team like BDS. They are not another team in the middle of the standings. They are one of the scarier teams in the league, and the fact that GX couldn't go toe-to-toe, it's not their fault. Antonio is going to get done of the game. I like Antonio. I think he's been really good this split, a lot better than I was anticipating, but Adam is just straight up better than him, and we saw that in the 1v1. The mechanical difference was very noticeable, and the Gragas was just never really relevant. But I think you could give dead of the game to basically anybody on GX. This was just a bit of a macro gap, a bit of a team gap, if you will. I don't think it was necessarily GX getting absolutely pummeled. I don't think it was them just losing across the board. It was more so BDS just getting small advantage after small advantage after small advantage and just translating that into a very easy and clean win. Juhan, Jackie's, they didn't have particularly good games. I think Jackie's, didn't look nearly as good on the Ezreal mid. That's something to continue to monitor. That pick has not looked good so far in the LEC. Or really, it looks like that was a Quid specialty and maybe not something that we should be seeing super regularly at the pro level. A little bit too in your bag there. Patrick and Ignore were generally fine. I didn't have a problem with them. Juhan didn't really have any pressure this game, but he also didn't make any major errors. Again, it was just one of those games where GX was a little less proactive because BDS controlled the map and, played it out really well. They didn't make any mistakes and they won the game. I'm not going to blame GX for losing this. They probably should have lost and they didn't lose super egregiously, and BDS looked super clean and super good. This is, again, a team that could really make some noise so long as they actually keep this pace up. They've really struggled towards the end of the split, and there is real question marks about whether or not this team can actually beat teams that are better than them, or whether or not they're just going to be kind of bottom of the standings merchants and picking up wins against teams that they should be able to beat. But at least for now, 6-1 is just about as good as you could ask for. But now moving on to game number 3 here of day 2, and it is the match of the week here in the LEC as we saw Fnatic taking on G2 Esports. And G2 is going to pick up the win here. They're going to move to 5-2. They're going to give Fnatic their first loss of the split, and G2 cementing themselves as still the team to beat here in the LEC. I think a lot of people were waiting for Fnatic to take that spot. They were looking at this matchup as a potential moment in time where Fnatic could usurp G2 in terms of expectations. I'm going to spoil it. Even if Fnatic won this game, I'm not entirely sure I would have put them at number 1 in my power rankings. I definitely would have considered it, but again, we've talked so much about how G2 has literally nothing to play for right now, and even with that, they come out here with a very clinical game plan and they just beat Fnatic. They're just better than Fnatic. A lot of underperformances from Fnatic's side, the two players that have been their most important over the course of this year, that are their most important in terms of how they win games, played really bad in this game, and that's going to lead to a loss. There really isn't a lot of ways to salvage a game like that for Fnatic, but for G2, I want to give some credit, because this was a huge game for Hans Sama. I mean, he was unbelievably good in this game. Disregard the one bailout play down in the bot lane. Outside of that, he was unbelievably good on Ashe. He's easy choice for player of the game for me. I think Broadcast gave it to Yike. Very surprised about that. I thought Hans was significantly better than Yike in this game. Not that Yike was bad. Trust me, I love Yike, and we'll talk about his ability to create chances on the Sejuani, but Hans's ability to follow up on the Ashe was really good. This is one of the best games he's played all year. And honestly, I've probably been a bit too harsh on Hans Sama. I've talked about him like he's some horrible AD carry. He's really not. He's still a top, 2 or 3 AD carry in the LEC at absolute worst. The difference is like, everybody else in G2 is supposedly, like, the best in the West, right? Like, Caps is the best mid laner in the West. Yike is certainly in contention for best jungler in the West. Broken Blade certainly in contention for best top laner in the West. And Hans and Mickey just haven't felt like that. They're not a bot lane that has really dominated. Mickey has really struggled this year, and Hans, I think, has been a bit of a byproduct of that. And Hans also just isn't an elite player. He's a good player, maybe even in a super above average player, like a B+, but he's not like a perfect player. He's going to have bad games every once in a while, but he still is going to have really good games, and this was one of those really good games. It's by far his best game of the split so far, and I'm really happy to say that. I want to give credit where credit's due. I know I've been hard on Hansama, but this was a really good performance. Yike was also very good here. He did like deserve player of the game. I just think Hans deserved it a bit more, but Yike was very good at setting things up. He was significantly better than Razork in this matchup, and that is huge for G2. Fnatic basically can't win if Razork is not doing anything out of the jungle, and we'll talk about why that wasn't the only problem Fnatic had, but Razork not having any pressure, the Vi in particular not really having any pressure on that side, you know, just going in and dying on repeat really meant that Fnatic had no way to actually initiate these fights because the Leona and the Zac were never really going to be able to do that against a Corki and Ashe and a Renata, things like that. It becomes a lot more difficult to end up pulling the trigger if you don't have the Vi working for you, and Yike was just way too good in the mid game, and he created so much separation that G2 ended up getting that massive lead. Everybody else was good as well. I think Caps was incredible this game. His scoreline doesn't indicate that, but he dominated that laning phase when he had absolutely no right to. He has Humanoid's number. He always has. And then Mickey X was really good. Broken Blade was good as well on the top side. I certainly don't want to, like, downplay his game. It's just everybody on G2 played well, and this was mostly Hans and Yike to me really showing up. And then for Fnatic, they just can't win if Razork and Huma aren't playing well. This felt like 2022. This felt like 2023, where when they faced big competition, Razork and Humanoid just completely disappeared. That was something that became really regular for this team, and a big reason why I was so pessimistic about Fnatic, not only last year, not only the year before, but going into this year, was Razork and Huma as a duo were never really consistent. When they had to play from behind, they were always a lot worse. Now, they haven't really had to play behind a lot this year. That they've really been in a lot of good situations. They've been really consistent in the early game. Huma hasn't really had those level 3 deaths that became so common for him over the past couple of years, but this is maybe the worst game he's played in 2024. It certainly is, and I would say it's by a ginormous margin. He's dead of the game. Humanoid was horrible in this one on Talia. Like, this was an int-worthy performance, and you gotta live with this if you're a Humanoid or a Fnatic fan. You just have to live with the fact that this is going to happen every once in a while. We had thought that this had been weeded out of the game. I actually talked earlier in the week about how important it was for Humanoid to have been so self-sustainable in a lot of these matchups, for him to have been so, consistent. He didn't need to be the carry, didn't need to be getting a ton of assistance or resources in order to be useful on things like Talia. That was really a big positive for me as a secondary carry, but unfortunately that might not work against teams like G2 that are just as talented, where a player like Caps can actually punish Humanoid a bit more. So we saw kind of the negatives, the downsides of that in this game. Razork was also horrible. Already talked about that. The mid-jungle duo was just really disappointing for Fnatic. And quite frankly, it's the reason they lost. Like, those two underperforming is why they couldn't beat G2, and it's why they've struggled to beat G2, because these two pretty historically do not perform against G2. But Noah and Jun continue to be generally fine. Noah looks really good on Ezreal. It just didn't really matter. Oscar Rinnan was on the top side playing Zac. He didn't lose the game for his team. He really just wasn't all that useful at all. This was a mid-jungle gap in terms of G2. Yike and Caps were unbelievable, and Hansama did a great job capitalizing on those advantages. This solidifies that G2 is still the team to beat in Europe, in the LEC. They are still the best team. I know not a lot of people really pushed back on that. I don't think anybody was really frustrated with me keeping G2 at number 1 even after their weird week number 1, but this has become clear. They are the best team in the LEC, and they have not been proven otherwise. Fnatic, unfortunately, as good of a split as they're having, G2 is still just a little bit better. That MSI buff is still there, but it's going to be interesting to see how this team adapts and responds to this kind of speed bump, this roadblock that they have run into. They really have not been tested since coming back from MSI, so going to be interesting to see how they move forward, but really no questions anymore about G2 for me. Then moving on now to game number 4 here in week 3, and it's a top versus bottom team here, as we saw SK Gaming taking on Mad Lions Koi, and SK Gaming predictably is going to be able to pick up the win here. This really wasn't all that close. I know the scorelines actually look relatively okay for Mad Lions, and I think this game was a little bit better for them than they had played in recent memory, but that is not really saying all that much. This team is mentally burned. Like, they are just making mistakes that they were not making earlier on in the year. The level of play that we are seeing from these individual players in team fights sides, in laning phase, wherever, has just gotten significantly worse. This team has really sunk into the 1-6 mentality. They are sitting alone in last place right now. They are the only team that's going to be left with 1 win at the end of the week, and that is as disastrous as it could possibly get. Being alone in 10th place is not ideal. This is very likely a bottom 2 team, at least with the way that they are currently playing. It doesn't feel like things are getting better. They have to figure something out next week. If they go 2-0 next week, they are safe. I think guaranteed. Maybe not guaranteed, but like 3 wins should be enough to get you into top 8, but they gotta be able to step on the gas quick. This was a tough week for them in terms of schedule, but it's not been good enough in terms of the games before this. But for SK Gaming, they're awesome, man. I mean, they just continue to roll along. This is a very complete team. It feels like a lot of the problems that I have with them are starting to get fixed. I still don't know how they're going to do against the best teams in the league. We saw what they did against Fnatic. We saw that Isma could potentially still struggle against really good junglers, but Elyoya has not been a really good jungler so far, and, you know, that's really the only avenue where I think SK could potentially be punished. Their bot lane is the best in the LEC, and it's not close. Rahel is going to get player of the game once again here on the Kai'Sa. This guy's going to win MVP for the summer split unless something changes. He has really come in and just dominated from moment one. You know, we knew Rahel was going to be good. Of all of the, you know, I've said this before on the channel, of all of the Korean imports that we've gotten, you know, whether it's been Noah or Ice coming into the LEC in recent times, all of them came in and were really good, but none of them were quite the prospect that Rahel was for DK Challengers. He was by far the most touted of the prospects. I'm not going to say he was like berserker in terms of what he was expected to be as a young player in the LCK Challengers system, but he was pretty darn close. He was a really good AD carry for a really good Challengers League team, and he came over here to the LEC, but he has, you know, hit the ground running, as they say. I think the addition of Luan has helped, even if Luan wasn't this super highly touted prospect. I just think that, you know, it's very clear that his comfortability on this team is high. His ability to play his level of game is really good. The 2v2s are better. The team fighting is better. He feels comfortable playing within structure. He's just the best AD carry in the LEC. This was a super weak role in the LEC before Rahel got here. There were essentially no AD carries that I felt great about. There were no A-tier AD carries. Rahel has very much changed that conversation. He has come in and been an A-tier AD carry, essentially, from day one. Luan has helped with that, but it's really been Rahel, who I think is like the star of SK Gaming. He might even drag them to Worlds. I think Irrelevant was also big. Of course, Skarner is one of those champions where it's really hard to tell how much of it is the player and how much of it is the champion, especially in his current form, but the Skarner was super important, probably the second most valuable champion in this game behind the Kai'Sa. I think some people even gave him player of the game. I totally understand that the Skarner was everywhere, but again, how much of that is the player, how much of that is the champion? Isma, Niski, Luan, they were all good, but Rahel is the star of SK Gaming, and if this team continues to rise up the ranks, if they end up finishing in the top 3, if they end up making the World Championships, you've got this bot lane to thank. It really is that simple. And then for Mad Lions, it's unfortunate. I do want to have this conversation. You know, Supa is going to get dud of the game, and he was really bad in this one. He was making uncharacteristic mistakes in terms of his positioning and his mechanics. He was missing Qs on Zeri. This is stuff we just weren't really seeing out of him at the beginning of the year. I'm willing to chalk a lot of this up to the fact that this team is garbage and that the atmosphere is probably miserable right now. You can see it on stage when it comes to this team. I mean, it's the same thing with K-Corp, where you just watch them and it seems like they're miserable trying to play the game. But the community sentiment around Supa, and first of all, I tweeted this out. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I am a lot more, I guess, succinct about my points over on Twitter. I'll definitely put out my thoughts and opinions there without really thought on how it gets across. If you want to just hear my raw, unfiltered opinions, it's a little bit more processed on the channel. Go follow me there if you want that. But I put out on Twitter that I feel like it's such a shame. It's pretty criminal that Supa has become like the villain of the LEC. I think that it's entirely unjustified and entirely unwarranted. He came out, and I get that he was a little bit grandiose in what he said, but first of all, you want to see confidence, especially an AD carry player, but really the point that he was trying to make is that he was better than AD carries in the LEC, and quite frankly, for a majority of this year, he has been right. Like, going into summer, he was probably the second best AD carry in the LEC in terms of his performance. You know, he was my number 1 ADC in the winter split. I thought he was the best AD carry in the league in the winter split. It wasn't quite as true in spring, but he was still very good for this team, and he was the reason they were staying relevant. And so far this split, he was, for the most part, the only one that wasn't chain inting every single game that they had. He was the only one offering any sort of positives. You know, him and Alvaro were trying their best to win in the 2v2, and the top side of the map was just completely imploding. I think people were really waiting for a game like this where he played really poorly to, you know, bounce onto it and be like, ha ha ha, ha ha ha, now we can laugh at you for saying that whole thing, you know, that you were better than everybody else. When really at the end of the day, he correctly said that LEC AD carries suck. Like, he was right about that. It's not really all that up for debate. The AD carries in the LEC just aren't very good, and Supa came in and was just about as good as a lot of them, and I just think it's sad that as that he's adopted this villain persona, that the community wants to see him fail so much, because he really is probably the most promising young European player in the LEC. Like, he is like the most interesting young LEC player right now, and for him to just so early be labeled as a villain, you know, similar to like Whippo or Inspired over in the LCS right now, I just think it's a bit of a shame. I definitely wouldn't have done it myself. I'm a big fan of Supa. I think he will continue to grow. We've seen so many rookies go through bad slumps, especially when their team is bad. For him not to be the one to put his team on the back, like, it's not a bad thing. We've seen so many people be in his position that are better than him that have not been able to drag their teams to good success. So I'm not freaking out about Supa. He had a bad game. We'll live with that. Mad Lions is terrible, and they're terrible for a lot of different reasons. Merwin is not a good top laner. I mean, he has been completely exposed over the course of this split. He was exposed in spring as well. Like, he was truly bad in spring, but he has been even worse in summer here. Elyoya, Frescowy, they've lost all levels of communication, lost all levels of synergy. Elyoya, like I've said earlier, is having his worst split ever. Frescowy is really regressed. Supa and Alvaro now aren't even playing well, and they were the only people that were even trying to win games for MDK. At the beginning of the split, this looks like a fast 10th for them, and it's a really disappointing finish for a team that made finals in the winter split. It's just really sad to see where they have fallen. And for SK Gaming, again, this team could be a Worlds team. They really have upgraded that much. They are by far the best bot lane in the LEC, at least in their current iteration, and honestly, I'm really excited to see what they can do. Their solo lanes are very good. It's all up to whether Isma can continue to grow and get more stable in the jungle, and if he can do that, if he can just allow the rest of the team to win games for him, I mean, SK is going to be one of the scarier teams at the end of the year. And then moving on to our final game of week number 3, and man, there's a lot to talk about with this one. It's K-Corp taking on Team Vitality, and K-Corp is going to pick up the win here. They have now eclipsed the 2-7 mark that they have set for themselves in the first 2 splits. They have gotten to 3 wins. They're only 1 game below 500, which feels insane with how they have played this split so far, because so many of their players are playing so poorly. This team has at no point felt like a team that is going to compete anywhere near top 5 or top 6, yet here we are. We're sitting at the end of week number 3, and now that we know our standings, they're in 5th place by themselves in the standings at 3 and 4. This has honestly been a pretty good split, all things considered, for K-Corp. It feels like they've lucked out and taken care of some teams that have really been disappointing, but I don't know, this could actually be kind of good for them. The rest of the league is such a disaster that somehow, some way, K-Corp playing the way that they are right now with only a couple of good plays every once in a while could be a team that ends up finishing top 5 or top 6 or somewhere around there in the LEC, which feels pretty ridiculous, but Vitality is in freefall mode. I mean, we talked about it last week. Carzzy and Hilly played really well for basically the entirety of last week. Carzzy in particular had a really good week, but we've seen this story before. This is nothing new for Vitality. This isn't anything new for this group of Vitality players. Yes, Linsas is in now into the jungle, and I do think that was an upgrade over Douglas, even if that hasn't exactly played out. He's basically been exactly what Douglas was for this team, just with a different set of champions. Instead of Brand, it's Sejuani now. But, like, Carzzy and Hilly are always going to dictate whether or not this team can be consistent, and when they lose bot 2v2 in the ways that they did this week, it's just not really going to work out. So we'll talk about it. Player of the game, it's gonna go to Targamas, and this feels like a pretty, new thing, but actually he's been good in their wins, I would say overall. The big problem for Targamas is that he really does not know how to play from behind, and this team is constantly losing. Their 2v2 has been very weak. His inability to really play from neutral has been a big negative for this team, but when he does get a lead, when the team does get a lead, he's really, really good at being able to set up aggressive plays for his team. The problem is that when they're losing, he's just often disconnected from what the rest of the team wants to do, and so when you get a good situation like this, when bot lane just wins super hard 2v2 when they get themselves into a strong position in the mid game, now all of a sudden Targamas can get this elite rel engage at the end of the game to just set up and win the game for K-Corp, and that's a really good sign. Again, Targamas is not this player without any, positives. He's not this completely lost cause down in the support position. He just has very, very clear flaws. He has very, very clear negatives towards his game plan and the way he plays the game, but when things do go his way, when he is, a player that gets to play from ahead, when he is in a position where he gets to play from an advantageous state, he looks really good in that circumstance. Upset was also very good here. The bot lane in general was a big positive for K-Corp. This is probably Upset's most consistent game that he's had in a little while. He's been fine for this team. Again, he's not been the biggest problem by any stretch of the imagination, but it's kind of been the same story of Upset on a lot of the last couple of teams. It feels very similar to the Origin team that he was on, feels very similar to Vitality last year, where Upset is individually playing fine, but oftentimes he is also disconnected from the rest of the team. He's not really helping out what they want to do, and he is just very, very passive in terms of how he wants to approach the game. That's not always going to be a good thing, but, it worked out for them in this game because Carzzy and Hilly were not very good. Closer also had by far his best game of the split. I think that's a very encouraging sign. I was very critical of Closer early on in the week. I do not think he's been good for K-Corp, but it's Closer. If he's able to play aggressive early, if he is going to try and snowball games out of control, that's what he does really well as a player. That's where he was at his comfort zone when he was on those good teams, 100 Thieves and Golden Guardians back in the day over in North America. So again, I just want to see more aggression. Kana followed up really well in the Targamas engage. Vladi was generally fine, didn't have to do all that much on Yone, but he's probably been this team's best player, at least their most consistent player. So I feel pretty good about K-Corp at like a baseline level. Like they're not a bottom 2 team, or at least I wouldn't expect them to be a bottom 2 team, but man, they're sitting in 5th place. They are not a 5th place team, or at least they shouldn't be a 5th place team. With how bad the rest of the league is though, I guess you never really know. And then for Vitality on the other side, again, this is just the inconsistency that we always talk about. I get comments every single split talking about how great Carzzy has been over the course of this year, and I feel like people just have selective memory of games like this. And I'm not saying that like, oh, here's one game to prove my entire point. It's that games like this have happened super regularly. He'll have weeks like he did in week number 2, you know, throughout the entire split. We've had a lot of really good performances from Carzzy. We've had performances where he plays like a top 3 AD carry, and when you look at those games, you're like, yeah, he's top 2, top 3, but it's just forgetting about the weeks where he looks bad, like he did this week, where, you know, he comes off of a really strong week and all of a sudden doesn't look nearly as consistent. Vitality reminds me so much of KT Rolster right now in terms of how they end up playing. Carzzy is kind of the Pioshik of this team, if you will. They are going to win or lose and die by Carzzy, and that's just how it is. He's going to get dead of the game here. He was really bad on the Varus. I think people are going to look at Hylissang getting caught face-checking that brush at the end of the game. But he was really good before that. He was the one trying to keep them alive in terms of disengaging threats, and so I'm not going to punish him too much. I thought Carzzy was overall worse in this game, but generally speaking, the bot lane in general got gapped. Upset and Targamas were better than Carzzy and Hylissang. Think about that more than just like Upset or Targamas getting player of the game and Carzzy and Hilly getting dud of the game kind of thing. Linsas also is just not doing what I thought he would for this team. I thought he was going to come in and just be a better version of Douglas. I thought he was going to enable a lot of these super aggressive carries to just work. Photon, VTO, Carzzy, you know, they have enough talent on this team to be able to win games, but Linsas has not come in and been that star. VTO is just very passive in the mid lane, and when he's not playing aggressive, you know, they just don't really have anywhere to go, and Photon's not been Photon this split. There's really no other way to put that. Vitality has just lost all of the fun Vitality stuff that they do. They're not even the aggressive team that's losing anymore. They still are getting leads in the early to mid game. They just are so bad at team fighting, and they make so many critical errors in the back half that it doesn't even really matter. So I'm pretty out on Vitality, but again, this team could win a ton next week, and I wouldn't really be all that surprised. They're that flippy. It's just really hard to get a read on them. And then for K-Corp, you know, they're fine, I guess. Like, they're not bottom 2. 3 wins is probably going to be enough to get them into the playoffs for the first time since they've joined the LEC, but is that really the barometer? Like, I don't know. This team doesn't feel like they're ever going to be able to compete, but I'm glad that they're at least doing good enough. And, you know, with their record, they're honestly really not doing all that bad, all things considered. If they can use this to propel themselves upwards and really start to build confidence off of this, then yeah, they put themselves in a decent position, even if I don't think their gameplay has necessarily matched their record. All right, but that is going to do it for my LEC week number 3 overview and analysis video here in the summer split. Up on the screen now, the updated standings after 3 weeks of action. Any ties will just be broken alphabetically as per usual. No favoritism attempted to be shown here. So many ties in the LEC, so many teams at 2 and 5 right now. It truly is ridiculous how bad the league is, quite frankly, from a depth perspective. But the top 4 teams are the top 4 teams, and that is solidified by the 4 of them all qualifying for the playoffs. They've all locked a spot in. They don't have anything to worry about moving into the final week of the season. Not that that is shocking to anybody watching this, and their power rankings aren't going to change. If you want to see my power rankings, it's in the first column to the right under the power rank column. That's going to be where I personally rank these teams from number 1 to number 10. Change is going to be how that has changed from last week going into this week. Top 4, not moving at all. Still think G2's number 1. I still think Fnatic is a clear number 2, but SK, BDS, they still feel like they are 3 and 4 very, very clearly. I'm not going to move them around. There was nothing this week that convinced me that either of these teams were better or worse than the other, and of course, SK beat BDS, and so I'm not going to sit here and say that, you know, BDS has all of a sudden figured something out. I need to see them beat SK before I move them up. But number 5 is going to change. K-Corp is going to jump up to 5. How is that possible? Like, I'm saying that. I'm the one who made this power ranking, and I don't think that that's possible. They truly are the only team of these bottom echelon that showed anything this week. That showed literally any life in them. And so they're moving up to number 5, which is cool for them. Vitality is going to stay at number 6 with the awful, awful week that they had, with how horrible they played. They're going to stay at number 6 because who's better than them? Who has more upside than them that's below them? Who truly do you think you would pick against them? You know, guaranteed. Is Heretics better than them? Is GIANTX better than them? Is Mad Lions or Rogue or any of these teams better than Vitality? I don't think so. They at least had a good week last week, and I'm not going to forget about that, but man, Vitality looked horrible this week, so they at least have to drop to number 6. GIANTX somehow moves all the way up to number 7. I considered them for number 5. Like, truly, like, they were considered to be as high as that because, quite frankly, I feel like they are the most positive opinion that I have of all of those teams in the bottom echelon, the bottom 6 teams. Like, GIANTX is the one I feel the best about, but that's because they're overperforming their talent level. They just aren't good enough to be able to compete at an upper level. When they're going up against teams like Vitality and Heretics and Corp, they shouldn't be able to beat them. They're beating them because they're underperforming, not because GIANTX is doing something ridiculous. But, you know, I have to move these other teams below them, so they move up to number 7. Heretics is just going to hang on at number 8 outside of the bottom 2. I really had to make a judgment call on who I think would not be in the bottom 2, and Heretics was the one that I ended up making that call on. Mad Lions still going to stay at 9. I still think Rogue's the worst team in the league. I get that they won a game this week. Like, I get they looked okay, but they were handed that win by Heretics, and I don't think that that's repeatable. I still think Rogue is the worst team in the LEC. I think Mad Lions is second to them right now, though, and they are going to fall into the bottom 2. They have the worst record in the league, and right now they are on pace to miss the playoffs, which would be an utter disaster for a team that made finals this year. And so, absolute disaster across the bottom 6 of the standings. But hey, at least the top 4 are looking good. Let me know what you agree with or disagree with. I really want to make the point clear that I said at the beginning of this video. Do not take these power rankings seriously. These LEC teams are just not separated. Like, it's all a crapshoot. If you wanted any of these teams in any of these positions, I honestly would totally understand. Really, there is no major difference between these numbers. I'm happy to hear your opinions down in the comments, but don't take what I say as gospel here. I'm a lot more attached to other regions' power rankings than I am to the LEC. But that's my power rankings. Time to move on to my player of the week and my dud of the week here for week number 3. Player of the week pretty easily is going to go to Adam, the top laner for BDS. He was excellent. Once again this week, Renekton, Cassante, neither of them are God's champions, and yet, what a shock. He still is pretty good. It turns out Adam is actually just a good top laner. It seems like whatever issues he had at the end of the winter split in terms of communication with the coaching staff, communication with the other players on the team, it feels like that is luckily behind him and behind the team overall, who is doing really well. So very happy to see that. Very happy to see Adam get back to the form that we know he can play at. He's player of the week. My honorable mentions, my runners-up, Yike, jungler for G2. G2 was great this week. They had a really big win over Fnatic, and Yike was the best player on G2 this week, pretty indisputably. I definitely considered him, but overall, I thought Adam was a bit better. And then Rahel for SK Gaming. They are just kind of trucking along right now. They are looking really good, and Rahel and Luan are clearly the best bot lane in the LEC. Rahel is definitely a big front runner for MVP of the summer split right now, and I'm definitely excited to talk about that. But overall, in week 3, it's just an honorable mention. Player of the week is going to go to Adam. And then my dud of the week, unfortunately, is going to go to Zviru, the mid laner for Team Heretics. He's taken a major step back this split. He has honestly just been gapped every single laning phase by everybody that he's played into. I think you could realistically give this to either member of the Vitality bot lane as well, either Karzi or Hillisang. They were the 2 others that I really considered for this. They had a really bad week, all things considered, but I thought Zviru was just a little bit worse. And, you know, it's a really sad thing to say because I do think he showed some promise in the spring split. He wasn't perfect. He certainly wasn't a player that was dominating and really pushing himself up the rankings, but he was good enough to at least show some promise, especially in their best of 3s, but he has been really bad in the best of 1s, and Heretics in general has just been a disaster. So Zviru is going to get dud of the week, and Adam is going to get player of the week here in week number 3, and that is going to do it for my week 3 video here in the LEC. If you enjoyed, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We post about all 4 of the major regions, not just the LEC, every single week on this channel. That's LCS, LEC, LCK, LPL, as well as the NACL Tier 2 over in North America. So if you're interested in a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.